Welcome to the Fundamentals of Fitness, the podcast where we strip away the noise, the guilt, and the unrealistic expectations around health and fitness, and we focus on what actually works in real life. I'm Alison, your no-nonsense coach. So whether you're out for a walk, driving to work, or in the gym, or just taking a bit of time for yourself, welcome, and thanks for being here. Today we're going to talk about motivation, or more specifically, why motivation might be one of the most overrated things in fitness. Now, before you panic, I'm not saying motivation is bad. Motivation is brilliant when it's there. The problem is that most people build their entire plan around something that was never designed to be consistent. And that's what we're diving into today. So pop on those trainers or grab that cuppa and let's dive right in. I don't think I've ever had a client come to me and say, Alison, I have too much motivation. What I hear is usually the opposite. I just need to get motivated. I've lost my motivation. I wish I could stay motivated. I'll start again when I feel motivated. And I completely understand it because motivation feels amazing. When you're motivated, everything feels easier. You want to train, you want to meal prep, you want to go for walks. You want to make those healthy choices. Motivation creates momentum. It creates excitement. It creates possibility. The problem is motivation isn't designed to stay. And once we understand that, we stop treating the loss of motivation like something has gone wrong. Because nothing has gone wrong. You'll simply experience something completely normal. And understanding that can be incredibly freeing. So let's start with a simple question. Have you ever felt incredibly motivated to make a change? Maybe it was New Year's Day. Maybe it was after a holiday. Maybe it was after seeing a photo of yourself. Maybe it was after a doctor's appointment. Maybe it was after stepping on those scales. Maybe it was after watching someone else's transformation online. For a moment, everything feels clear. You know exactly what you're going to do. You're going to start training. You're going to eat better. You're going to get your life together. And for a few days, sometimes even a few weeks, everything goes brilliantly. Then something happens. Life returns to normal. Work gets busy again. You get tired. The weather changes. The excitement fades. And suddenly the same plan feels harder. Not because the plan changed, because the emotion changed. And that's where many people start worrying. They think, what's wrong with me? Why can't I stay motivated? But here's the truth. You never are supposed to stay motivated. Motivation is an emotional state, and emotional states naturally fluctuate. Think about confidence. Are you equally confident every day? Of course not. Some days you'll feel confident, some days you don't. The same is true of enthusiasm, energy, optimism, focus, and motivation. The mistake isn't losing motivation. The mistake is expecting motivation to carry the whole journey. Because motivation is fantastic at helping people start. It's just not very good at helping people continue. And one of my clients used to restart every Monday, every single Monday. Monday, she was motivated. Wednesday, she was struggling. Friday, she'd gone off track. By Sunday, she decided she'd start again tomorrow. And the cycle repeated week after week, month after month. It wasn't because she didn't care. It wasn't because she wasn't trying. It was because her plan relied entirely on staying motivated. And motivation is simply too unreliable for that job. Motivation is an excellent spark, but it's a terrible fuel source. Now that we've established that motivation isn't something we're supposed to have all the time, let's talk about what motivation actually is. Because I think a lot of people imagine motivation as something you either have or you don't. almost like it's a personality trait. Some people are motivated, some people aren't. Some people have drive, some people don't. But in reality, motivation is much more like a feeling than a personality trait. It's a temporary emotional state, just like excitement, just like confidence, and just like enthusiasm. And because it's a feeling, it naturally comes and goes. That's important, because if you believe motivation should always be there, every dip feels like failure. But if you understand that motivation is supposed to fluctuate, you stop panicking every time it disappears. Think about it this way. Have you ever been really excited about a holiday? The weeks leading up to it, you're planning, counting down, thinking about it all the time. Your motivation is high. Then eventually the holiday arrives, and after a few days, the excitement settles. That doesn't mean the holiday is bad. It means the emotional high naturally levels out. The same thing happens with fitness. And in the beginning of a new goal, motivation is often sky high. Everything feels fresh. Everything feels possible. Everything is exciting. Then the novelty wears off, and suddenly you're left with something much less exciting: the work. The repeated workouts, the repeated walks, the repeated meals, the repeated habits. And that's where the real progress begins, because that's where consistency matters. Let's think about someone like Jessica Ennis-Hill. When people watch elite athletes competing at the Olympics, it's easy to assume they're constantly motivated. But Olympic preparation isn't a few weeks of excitement. It's years. Years of training, years of repetition, years of doing the basics over and over and over again. Do you think every single training session felt exciting? Of course not. Some sessions would have felt amazing, some would have felt ordinary, and some would have felt difficult. But the sessions still happened. Not because the motivation was always there, because the behavior had become part of the process. And that's a lesson all of us can learn from. Because if elite athletes only trained when they felt motivated, they'd never become elite athletes. And neither would the rest of us achieve much in life. One of the biggest myths I see is this idea that action follows motivation. That first you get motivated and then you take action. Sometimes that happens, but very often the opposite is true. Action creates motivation, not motivation creating action. Think about the last time you didn't feel like going for a walk. You debated it, negotiated with yourself, made excuses. Eventually you went anyway. And what happened 10 minutes later? You probably felt better, right? More energized, more positive, more motivated. The motivation arrived after the action, not before it. And this happens all the time. People don't feel like training, then they train, and afterwards, they're glad they did. People don't feel like meal prepping, then they do it, and afterwards, they feel more in control. People don't feel like starting, then they start, and suddenly it feels easier. That's because action changes state. Action creates momentum. Action creates evidence. Action creates confidence, and very often action creates motivation. I remember working with a client who used to tell me, I'll come back when I feel motivated again. And every time motivation disappeared, she'd stop. Then she'd wait and wait and wait for motivation to return. The problem was it rarely did, because she was waiting for a feeling that was often created by action. And once she understood that, she changed everything. Instead of asking, when will I feel motivated? She started asking, what's the smallest thing I can do today? Sometimes that was a workout. Sometimes it was a walk. And sometimes it was simply prepping lunch for the next day. But every action created a little momentum. And that momentum often created the motivation she'd been waiting for. I think this is one of the most liberating things people can learn. You do not need to feel motivated before you act. You simply need to act, even in a small way, because motivation isn't always the cause of action. Very often it's the result. And once you understand that, you'll stop sitting around waiting to feel different, and you start creating the conditions that help your motivation return. think one of the most dangerous things people do in fitness is wait. Not because they're lazy or because they don't care, but because they're waiting for the perfect moment. They're waiting for life to calm down, or they're waiting for work to get less stressful. They're waiting until the kids are older. They're waiting until after Christmas, after the holiday, after the busy period, after they feel more confident, after they feel more motivated. And on the surface, that sounds sensible because life feels chaotic. Surely it makes sense to wait until things are easier. The problem is life rarely stays easy for very long. There's always something. A busy period at work, a family commitment, an unexpected expense, an illness, a stressful week, a lack of sleep. Real life doesn't pause and give us a perfect window to work on ourselves. And if your health is always waiting for perfect conditions, you can end up waiting for a very long time. And I hear when things settle down, and this is a trap, I hear it a lot. Things are just a bit hectic at the moment. I'm going to start properly when things settle down. The funny thing is, when I speak to the same person 3 months later, things still haven't settled down. Not because they're doing anything wrong, because life is life. There will always be challenges. There will always be responsibilities. And there will always be reasons not to start. And that's why waiting is so dangerous, because it creates the illusion that progress is just around the corner, that you'll start soon. That future you will somehow have more time, more energy, more motivation, and fewer responsibilities. But future you is usually dealing with exactly the same reality, just on a different date. One of the biggest mindset shifts I ever see in clients is when they stop waiting to feel ready, because most people assume readiness comes first. First you feel confident, then you take action. First you feel motivated, then you take action. First you feel capable, then you take action. But very often it works the other way around. You take action, then your confidence grows. You take action, then capability grows. You take action, then motivation grows. The action comes first. The feeling comes later. I remember speaking to a lady a while ago who wanted to start training for months. Every time we spoke, she had another reason why now wasn't quite the right time. Work was busy. She felt stressed. She wanted to lose a bit of weight before coming to the gym. She wanted to feel more confident first. And honestly, I understood every single reason. They were all genuine. But eventually I asked her a simple question. What if confidence isn't something you need before you start? What if confidence is something you build because you start? And that changed her way of looking at things, because she realized she'd been waiting for a feeling that training itself could help create. A few weeks later, she started. And do you know what happened? She wasn't magically confident. She wasn't suddenly fearless, but she was proud of herself. And that pride became her confidence, not before the action, after it. So let's think about more elite athletes for a moment. Do you think they always feel ready before a major competition, a championship, a race, a final? Of course not. Many athletes talk openly about nerves, doubt, pressure, uncertainty. The difference is that they don't wait for those feelings to disappear before taking action. They act in spite of them. And through that action, confidence often grows, because confidence isn't built by thinking, it's built by doing. The other problem of waiting is that it often keeps people stuck in the same place, not physically, mentally, because every week they don't start becomes another week of, I should, I need to, I really ought to. And carrying those thoughts around is exhausting. Sometimes the biggest relief comes from simply beginning. Not perfectly, not dramatically, just beginning. A walk, a workout, a healthy breakfast, a plan for tomorrow, something, anything. Because once movement starts, momentum has a chance to build, and momentum can change everything. So let me ask you something. What are you currently waiting for? Are you waiting for more motivation, more confidence, more time, less stress, a quieter week? And what if that thing isn't actually the starting point? What if the starting point is simply taking the first small step? Because readiness is often something you create, not something you discover. And the people who make progress aren't always the people who feel the most ready. They're often the people who start before they do. So if motivation isn't reliable and waiting doesn't work, what should you rely on instead? This is the point where some people expect me to reveal some secret, some magical mindset trick, some hidden productivity hack, some perfect morning routine maybe. But honestly, the answer is much simpler than that. You stop relying on motivation and start relying on systems. Now, if you've listened to the last few episodes, you'll know this is becoming a bit of a theme, and that's because it's true. The people who stay consistent aren't usually the people with the most motivation. They're the people with the fewest barriers. Think about that for a moment. Not the most discipline, not the most willpower, not the most motivation, the fewest barriers, because every barrier makes action less likely. If your workout requires an hour of driving, perfect weather, loads of energy, and a completely clear schedule, it's going to be difficult to sustain. If going for a walk means finding your trainers, charging your headphones, finding the perfect podcast, and waiting until you feel like it, it's less likely to happen. But if the barriers are low, action becomes easier, and easier actions get repeated. One of my favorite coaching tools is something I call minimum standard, because most people only have two settings: all or nothing, full program or quit, perfect week or failure. And that's a terrible way to approach consistency, because life isn't always going to allow your best effort. Some weeks you're going to be busy, some weeks you're going to be tired, and some weeks you're going to have other priorities, and that's okay. The goal is never perfection. The goal is staying connected to the process. So instead of asking, what's the perfect week? Ask, what's the minimum I can do and it still count? I can still move forward. Maybe that's 2 workouts instead of 4. Maybe that's a 20-minute walk instead of an hour. Protein with every meal. Drinking more water. It's not perfect, but enough. Enough to maintain momentum. Enough to stay connected to the identity you're building. Enough to stop yourself from constantly restarting. Let's think about Lando Norris or Lewis Hamilton. People often imagine these performers as operating at 100% all of the time, but they don't. They aren't. Their training loads change. Their recovery changes. Their intensity changes. The system adapts. What doesn't change is the commitment to the process, and that's the lesson here. The exact behavior might change, the standard might adjust, but the identity remains, the process remains, the commitment remains. Stop asking the wrong questions, and this might be the biggest takeaway from today's episode. Most people wake up and ask, do I feel motivated? And if the answer is no, they struggle. But it's the wrong question. A much better question is, what's the smallest version of this I can do today? Because that question creates action, and action creates momentum, and momentum creates motivation. See, now we've gone full circle. The thing that people are waiting for is often created by the thing they're avoiding. So let's make this practical. You don't feel like training. So instead of cancelling completely, maybe you just do the warm-up. You don't feel like meal prepping. Maybe you prepare tomorrow's lunch. You don't feel like going for a walk. Maybe you walk to the end of the road and back. Tiny actions. But tiny actions keep the engine running. And when the engine keeps running, progress becomes much easier to maintain. I think one of the most damaging beliefs in fitness is that successful people feel motivated all the time. Because they don't. They get tired. They get stressed. They get busy. They have bad days, just like everybody else. The difference is that they don't wait for motivation to return before taking action. They have systems. They have routines. They have minimum standards, and they keep moving. Not perfectly. Consistently. And that's available to all of us. So if there's one thing I want you to take away from today's episode, it's this. Stop waiting to feel motivated. Because motivation is wonderful, but it's unreliable. Instead, build something stronger. Build routines. Build systems. Build habits. Build identity that supports the behaviors you want. Because people who make progress long term aren't the people who feel like it every day. They're the people who keep showing up when they don't. Not because they're special, not because they're superhuman, but because they stopped relying on motivation to do all the heavy lifting. And once you do that, everything changes. And if you've enjoyed today's episode, share it with someone who's been waiting for motivation to magically appear, because chances are they don't need more motivation. They just need to take the first step. And if you're enjoying the fundamentals of fitness, make sure you're following the show so you never miss an episode. Next time, we're going to talk about confidence and why confidence is usually the result of action, not the requirement for it. Until then, train with structure, recover with intention, and build something that lasts. I'll see you in the next one.